Всем привет! Это подкаст «Глагольная группа». Здесь мы простым языком рассказываем о том, как сложно устроен язык. Меня зовут Дмитрий Коломацкий, я лингвист и Python-разработчик.
Меня зовут Игорь Исаев, я лингвист-диалектолог. Один из самых частотных ваших комментариев: «Я совсем не лингвист, но как интересно слушать». Дорогие друзья, если вы совсем не лингвист, то сейчас вас ждет испытание.
Ну, мы постараемся сделать вашу жизнь чуть-чуть сложнее, но так, чтобы вам не захотелось отойти. Это очень сложная задача, не знаю, насколько мы с этим справимся. Но представляя этого гостя, я не могу сдержать своего волнения. И я здесь, наверное, перейду на английский язык. So, together we are happy to present our guest, Martin Haspelmath, as I found on their website, senior scientist at the Department of Linguistic and Cultural Evolution at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig. Good evening, Martin. We are extremely excited to have you here.
Good evening. I'm very happy to be here.
Одно из самых больших удовольствий лингвиста, во всяком случае, те студенты, которых мы учим, у них идет соревнование, кто прочитал больше из Хаспельмата. Если вы пишете или читаете о конъюнкции, вы должны прочитать Хаспельмата. Если вы пишете о типологических особенностях языков, вы должны почитать Хаспельмата. Друзья, послушайте Хаспельмата.
Can you tell in a few words about your journey in linguistics and what got you interested in linguistics in the first place?
Yeah, that's always very interesting when I meet a linguist for the first time, and I was always very happy to hear how they got interested in linguistics, because especially studying lots of different languages around the world is something very special. For me, it was sort of two things having to do with my parents, not unexpectedly. So my father was a Lutheran minister, and he had to study not only Latin but also Greek and Hebrew. And we had these books, the Hebrew Bible and the Hebrew Dictionary. And so I was curious because there was these special letters. And so when I was 15 or 16, I started to study those letters and to study a bit of Hebrew on my own. In addition to Greek, I also had the fortune to study Greek and Latin in high school. And on my mother's side, there was also something interesting, because my mother spoke Polish as a child, because she was from an ethnic German family living in Łódź, Poland, and her parents had actually studied Russian. Because her father, my grandfather, was from Warsaw, and my grandmother was from Łódź, and they had both been good students in primary school, so they were allowed to go to Russian-speaking high school. So for my grandmother, it was Lodziskaya Zhenskaya Gymnazia, and she was very proud that she spoke Russian in that school, and that every year there was a special holiday where they were singing Bože Carya Chrani, and so this interest in Russian actually had to do also with my grandmother.
So you were exposed as a child to how many languages?
Well, not really exposed. Germany was very monolingual then, and we went on holiday to Sweden, and so that was sort of the first time I was abroad, and Swedish is not that exotic, but certainly it was sort of a good environment for getting interested in ancient languages and also in Eastern European languages, sort of languages that, many others wouldn't notice. They would go to Italy on vacation and study Italian maybe, or French. But for me, the Eastern European part was there also because of the family history.
And now you kind of represent the influence of anthropology on linguistics, so to say, if I may say so. So, how did you come to this sort of shift towards more contact with anthropology?
Well, For a long time, I thought of myself as primarily a comparative linguist. Actually, started out with historical comparative in European linguistics, or also Semitic linguistics, and then I got very much interested in typology and universals, and that didn't seem to have a clear connection with anthropology. But 25 years ago, I had the great fortune to get a position at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology. Then I thought more about the relationship between the study of the world's languages and the study of the world's cultures. But of course, anthropology is a very broad notion, and there's also physical anthropology and the way some people understand evolutionary anthropology, that it also involves the origin of the human species, how Homo sapiens is related to Neanderthals, and so on. So anthropology is really very, very broad, and the way our department relates to the other departments in the institute is sometimes not really very clear. So there's also a department of primatology, for example, where they study apes and other primates, and there isn't really very close connection between the various departments. So I'm kind of really a linguist, even though the term evolution has become sort of more and more important for me. So I would now say maybe I'm an evolutionary linguist, though if you call me an anthropological linguist, that's fine with me too. So I'm not so much of a cognitive linguist, I would say. In linguistics, cognitive linguistics has become very prestigious, and at some point I thought cognitive linguistics is what I want to do, but now anthropological linguistics fits better.
That fits perfectly into my next question. We are going to come back to language universals, obviously, a bit later on. But first of all, I want to ask you some general questions about language that are inspired by one of your lectures that I watched recently while preparing to this podcast. So in one of them, you were addressing the dilemma, or I don't know, of biological versus cultural nature of language. So can you tell us a little bit more about what this dichotomy looks like?
Well, yes, there is in the field of comparative linguistics a sort of split, which sometimes is sort of even an ideological split. So some linguists, especially those following Noam Chomsky, who's a very well-known name, sort of focus more on trying to explain the commonalities among human languages with respect to biological properties, what I call biocognitive constraints on the human language faculty. So they say all languages share certain properties because we're born with something that's sometimes called universal grammar, certain innate prerequisites for acquiring a language. And then on the other hand, there's this more socially, anthropologically oriented view of languages, where the emphasis is on explaining language structures with respect to what people do with their languages, that they communicate, that they interact with each other, that they construct their cultural environment on the basis of their languages. There's this kind of unfortunate split, and I've been trying over my career to somehow bring together, to the extent it's possible, the various claims and ideas and proposals of these different approaches. Mostly I'm sort of on the side of the social anthropological approach, but I've also tried very hard to think about the proposals of the biocognitive approach, of the Chomskyan approach. So I've been trying to take it very seriously and not just dismiss it, even though overall I find it more convincing to explain language structures with reference to the social embedding of language use.
So, like in many other cases, there shouldn't be one definitive answer, like this is only biology or this is only society. It can be a combination of both. And one more term that I heard was convergent evolution. And as far as I understood it, like we had, for example, George Starostin here recently, who talked about, reconstruction of languages and in every case trying to find out whether the similarity comes from a common ancestor or whether the similarity comes from language contact. And now it seems to me that you are introducing like the third factor in there, which is some language features can just develop independently. Is my understanding correct there?
Yes, absolutely. So George Starostin is well known for his work on historical comparative linguistics, where the focus is on explaining the divergence. So we have many related languages, like the various Slavic languages or the various Germanic languages that sort of go back to a common ancestor, like Proto-Slavic or Proto-Germanic. And we have many language families around the world, and they're being studied also at my department of linguistic and cultural evolution in Leipzig. So this is about looking at the divergence and sort of finding this common ancestor. And that research has been very successful and is very generally accepted. And it actually goes back 200 years. So I think it's a major robust finding of linguistics, actually. And now with respect to the other two sources of similarities between languages, like borrowing or language contact, as you mentioned, and convergent evolution, these are harder to understand and harder to identify. But that is a cutting-edge science that I'm interested in. And so in the World Atlas of Language Structures that we published in 2005, which was sort of the first atlas presenting structural similarities, like which languages have object-verb-word order, which languages have verb-object order, or which languages have tone, which languages lack tone, and so on. So in this atlas, we see there are a lot of geographical similarities that cannot be explained by inheritance through language families, by divergence. So we're trying to explain these similarities, but we're also trying to explain universals that are due to convergent evolution.
So how complex can be language features that can be explained by convergent evolution? Like if we count to 10 or to 20, I don't know, this is called decimal, and then the second, I may not be pronouncing correctly, vigesimal or like this.
Vigesimal, yeah.
Vigesimal. So this can be explained, like the emergence of vigesimal systems in different languages can be explained through convergent evolution. Is there anything, complex in grammar that can be explained through this?
Yes, there are many features of grammar that must have evolved independently again and again in different languages around the world. So, just like in biology, again and again, plants developed leaves or thorns, or animals developed wings. This is the most famous example that birds evolved wings and insects evolved wings, and even some mammals like bats. And these wings often look very similar, but they appeared independently. So similarly, as you mentioned, the decimal system for counting clearly evolved independently. It's so logical. You count with your fingers, and all humans have 10 fingers. So having decimal system is very logical. And then when the humans don't wear shoes like we do in cold Europe, you have your toes, right? So immediately you have 10 other digits, and so that gives you a vigesimal system. It's also a very functional system and very logical that languages would, if they want to say 40, well, they say it's like all the digits of two people, right? So with numeral system, that is easy to illustrate. But similarly, we find things in grammar where languages evolve, for example, accusative markers convergently, right? So we get into rather abstract things. So one of my favorite examples is the way in which the accusative is marked in Russian and in Spanish. So how do you say I saw the wolf? In Spanish, it's al lobo, using the preposition a. Lobo is the wolf. In Russian, it's volk. And how do you say I saw the wolf? It's volka. So again, you have an a. So where do they come from? The Russian a comes from the genitive. Somehow the genitive evolved into an accusative, a marker of the patient. In Spanish, it comes from the dative, the Latin preposition ad. And that was completely independent, but it shares certain crucial properties, namely it's especially animate objects that get the accusative marking. So that's what we call technically differential object marking or differential accusative marking. And when we look at other languages around the world, we see still other sources. So sometimes a form meaning with can become an accusative, or in Persian there's a form that originally meant something like about or so. Or, accusatives can arise in all kinds of different ways, so they can have different sources that sort of converge on an accusative marker. And so the kind of synchronic similarities are really obvious, and this is what we universalists or typologists study, and we can sort of see how they evolve convergently.
I think my one remark is, yes, of course, accusatives evolve convergently, because no matter where we live, no matter how we see the world, we want to accuse someone. So this is obviously really necessary. So I think my last question in the part of general discussion of language is this new notion that I discovered in your lecture was, I hadn't thought about it, is language change versus language evolution. I didn't realize you could talk about this kind of difference. And this evolution of language and evolution of linguisticality that you're talking about, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, we didn't used to talk about evolution. So this is really a new thing, language evolution. 20 years ago, this was not a thing. People talked about language change, and linguists had this fancy term diachrony. So this was coined by Saussure, and they were very proud of the Saussurean innovative approach as a founder of modern structural linguistics. And so we have diachronic change. But biology got more and more prestigious, and maybe also more and more funding. And so increasingly, 20 years ago or so, linguists started talking about evolution of languages as if language change were like biological evolution. And first I thought, but is it really like biological evolution? I mean, in biological evolution, that's rather different. We have this mutation and selection and this Darwinian evolution. That's rather different. We kind of, languages are not like different species or so. But then increasingly, after thinking more about it and reading more about Darwinian evolution, I realized that biological evolution can be thought of as a special case of a more general phenomenon of evolution, where really the basic ingredients are that you have sort of variation in the population, that you have replication in some abstract sense, and then some kind of selection process where not everything that's replicated actually makes it to the next generations. And so then, I realized that one can actually say that a simple notion of change applies only to individual objects. But when you have a population, then it really evolves. So it's populations of organisms like humans, or a population of plants or so. It evolves a species. And similarly, a language is also a population. It's a kind of population of utterances, perhaps, or a population of linguistic features. Languages are not things. You can, say, I built this house 20 years ago, and it changed a little bit. Some things don't work anymore, and so on, because it rained so much or whatever, right? So it's this thing, and a house changes, but a population isn't a thing. A population evolves. And so languages evolve in the same way as species evolve in biology. So therefore, I think it's okay and even insightful to replace talking about language change by talking about language evolution. It's not just that it makes it more prestigious, but also it's insightful. On the other hand, there's also the biological evolution of the language faculty. And that I called the biological evolution of linguisticality, on the analogy with musicality. Because musicality is sort of a well-recognized feature of humans, and people also talk about biological evolution of musicality. And so I thought linguisticality is sort of a nice analogy to musicality, because actually linguists have called the analogy to musicality, they've called it the language faculty. And that's actually a pretty good term, except that Chomsky used language faculty in a sense of rather a series of rather confusing different senses. So sometimes he equates language faculty with universal grammar, and so I was a bit confused by it. So what's meant by linguisticality is the capacity for language in a broad sense. So something that all humans have, and that consists of lots of different abilities, of course. So, you have to be able to articulate and to perceive, acoustically, and then further process the acoustic signal, segment them, and so on. So in addition to all the central processing of grammar. So linguisticality consists of a very broad set of different abilities.
And it evolves, just to make it clear. So we can say that this set of abilities evolves in humans?
It evolved at some point in the past, yes. So it's just like bats evolved their ability to echolocate and so on. Different biological species, different features evolve, or the special tails of the peacock and so on, right? So this is what biologists talk about. I'm a bit skeptical about the possibility of explaining the evolution of the language capacity, because it's very unique. It's like the zebra's stripes. They're also very difficult to explain, because there's almost no other animal that has such strange stripes. So I think biological evolution is comprehensible primarily when it happens again and again, when we have a lot of convergent evolution. So unique evolutions like the zebra stripes, or maybe the peacock's tail, or maybe human language, they're extremely hard to explain. So I think it's convergent evolution of linguistic features in the world's languages. They can be explained, but some things are unique. Also in languages, and these unique things really cannot be explained, I think.
Наконец-то пришла моя очередь задавать вопросы. Дмитрий Игоревич, как обычно, дорогие друзья, задает вопросы умные, а я вопросы буду задавать человечные. Мартин, мне очень хочется спросить давно, пока вот я слушаю вопросы предшествующие. Расскажите, пожалуйста, про свой интерес к русскому Кавказу. Вы ведь были, вы живьем, своими руками трогали эти языки. Как это получилось? Расскажите про это, пожалуйста.
Да, спасибо за вопрос на русском языке. Я мог бы, в принципе, отвечать также на русском языке, потому что 35 лет назад я провел 6 месяцев в Москве и много говорил на русском языке. But unfortunately, now my Russian is a bit rusty, and so I will continue in English. So, yes, so how did I get interested in the languages of the Caucasus? Well, there are two reasons. First of all, I wanted to do a sort of, 6 months stay in Moscow because I had heard from a friend that it's possible in principle to, interact with the Moscow linguistics community, and I needed some kind of research project for that stay. I got funding from the German Academic Exchange Service. There was a Soviet-West German agreement, and I was interested in typology even back in the 1980s. So I first came to Moscow for a Russian language course in 86 and then spent 6 months here in 89, 1990. And my project was to write a grammar of Lesgian. And so why did I want to do a grammar of Lesgian? Well, it could have been some other language of the Soviet Union, but I had met a Moscow linguist in Vienna, where I was studying, Igor Alexandrovich Melchuk. He was very famous in Moscow in the 1960s and 1970s, and after 1977 he lived in Canada, but he had friends in Austria, and so he came in the spring of 1983 to teach the Smysl text model, the meaning text model that he was continuing to develop in Canada. And he was interested in all kinds of things, all kinds of languages, in semantics, syntax, morphology, and he was really fascinating. And he actually prompted me to start to study Russian very seriously. So I had known some Polish and Russian because of my family connections, but then I decided I need to study Russian. And in order to be able to study Lesgian, which is one of the languages that he had studied. So it was the Russian linguist Melchuk who inspired me to come to Moscow and to study Lesgian.
Ну, это не все вопросы, которые у меня есть. Самый главный вопрос, который меня мучает, как диалектолога, который всегда держит карты в руках лингвистические. Удается ли при помощи атласов показывать родство и эволюцию языков? И как с этой точки зрения нам помогает Всемирный атлас лингвистических структур?
The World Atlas of Language Structures gives a very broad overview of grammatical structures, phonological structures, partly also lexical structures of the world's languages. It gives an impression. And to be honest, I'm not really sure that it helps us understand languages. So maybe one of the effects that it has had is to confuse linguists, unfortunately. But I sometimes say we need to be reminded that science is not just about making glorious discoveries, but it's also about realizing that some things that we thought was there aren't actually there. So, in the 1980s and 1990s, many linguists thought that there's an easy way of explaining a linguistic diversity, that there's a few parameters, maybe 20, 30 grammatical parameters by which languages differ. But after 2005, when our World Atlas of Language Structures was published, I think that illusion disappeared. People realized that diversity is just much, much greater, and that this earlier idea of the 1980s that maybe there's just a couple of dozen parameters that explain all of linguistic variation is that's just illusory. And so maybe we can compare the World Atlas of Language Structures with the success or non-success of Captain Cook's travels to the south. Captain Cook set out to discover a new continent because many geographers in Europe thought that there must be a terra australis incognita, a sort of unknown southern continent. They sort of knew about Australia, but they thought there must be some kind of big continent. And so he went south, and they thought there were many people living there that they have not encountered yet. So in addition to the Americas, there must be some counterweight. And so he traveled around the Pacific and found nothing, and then came back and said there is no terra australis incognita. So sometimes you think there's something, and then you do research and you realize, okay, it's not there.
Какую перспективу вы видите у Walls? Что он может дать лингвистам через 20 лет, через 30 лет?
Well, it's a lot of stuff, a lot of things that one can look at and get an impression. I think it's sort of a foundation of a different view of what linguistic diversity is like. There's nothing specific that it tells us. As I said, it makes us aware that diversity is much, much greater. And in a way, the World Atlas of Language Structures is already obsolete because last year, some of my colleagues at the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig published a much bigger database. It's called GramBank. It has 195 features. They're not quite comparable to the 140 features that we have, but there are many more languages. And so, in a way, the World Atlas of Language Structures has already had its time in linguistics. So, there are other databases now. There are also much bigger phonological databases. But it was a first, and so it was a pioneering achievement, and we are quite proud of it. And it's good to see a younger generation building on it, making new databases, bigger databases, applying new statistical methods, for example. And that is happening sort of every day. It's not that there are really great breakthroughs of understanding. I still think that the language families that we discovered in the 19th century are the major breakthrough of linguistics, breakthrough of understanding, and our current work on comparing languages just adds a lot of information, but a lot of that is rather confusing, and we struggle to understand it.
So another database that also has maps and that you sort of inspired was Glottolog. How did this idea come, and in what way is it, and in what way, if it is it better than, the coding system introduced by Summer Institute of Linguistics that gives every language that they think is good enough a code?
Yeah, the Glottolog is another project that we started at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology because increasingly around that time, around 2005, information was supposed to be available electronic and reusable by other scholars. So until the end of the 20th century, even though computers were invented in the middle of the 20th century and were important in some fields early on, but, until 2000 or 2005, really, we were thinking in terms of books, and that's really rather difficult to understand in the contemporary situation. But it was really only 24 years ago that I learned about Google, for example, and Google Maps. I think I learned about only in 2007 or so, and so all these tools that we now take for granted are relatively recent. So when the Ethnologue, the worldwide language catalog of the SIL International was created. It was a book, and in fact, until the 15th edition or so, it came out as a book, and then the Ethnologue came out as an online publication, and we thought about using the Ethnologue as sort of a standard for comparing languages, because if we want to exchange information about different languages from around the world with different scholars, we need some kind of code, some kind of reference information that we can all rely on. And we realized that the Ethnologue method was not ideal for our purposes, and also the SIL International is not really an academic organization, so they function a bit differently. They have different funding mode, and then they also teamed up with the International Standards Organization, maybe for financial reasons, I don't know. So they developed these ISO codes. But the International Standards Organization is really a commercial organization. It's a number of different commercial companies that get together and so on. So we thought we should do a language catalog of our own. So some people said, but why do you do that? The Ethnologue already exists. And in fact, we are standing on the shoulders of the SIL International. So, there's no question that without SIL International, it wouldn't have been possible to do Glottolog. But we sort of used their information and improved it for our purposes. That was really lucky. Harald Hammarström had been doing this sort of on his own as a sort of hobby, and then increasingly he realized that he could become part of a bigger enterprise if he joined it. And now he's a professor at the University of Uppsala, and he's also well established and is continuing this at the academic level. It's of course, as academics, we have some privileges that we don't rely on funding from companies or from private donors. So we realize that we're quite privileged now, and in a way it's a bit sad, because the Ethnologue, they're behind a paywall now, because they rely on users paying. So I hope they get enough subscribers. We have our model is everything is free, but it's also not so clear what will happen when the various people who support it retire. So, but we hope that somehow all of this information will continue to be available and will continue to be useful.
Мартин, скажите, пожалуйста, а насколько универсальны языковые универсалии? Можем ли мы говорить, что языковые универсалии охватывают все языки мира, или все-таки это речь о группе языков? И все ли мы знаем о языковых универсалиях сегодня?
Yeah, the term universals sometimes confuses people, or the way we use it, because when you hear universals, you think it should be a property that really is shared by all languages without exception. And there are, of course, some things that all languages have without exception. For example, all languages have an expression of negation. All languages have ways of asking questions. All languages have ways of talking about people and their actions and so on. So there are many things that are universal, actually, in that sense. Also some really grammatical universals, so like a negation word. Also, all languages have demonstratives, things like this and that. But there are also many things that not all languages have, or that even many languages lack, like past tense marking, right? Many languages don't really distinguish between I go and I went. Many languages don't have case marking, a distinction between nominative, accusative, or so. They just rely on word order or the context. So there are many surprising non-universals, and a few sort of very clear grammatical universals. But by and large, all languages can express the same thing. So you can translate, for example, this conversation in principle into all languages, or translate the Bible into all languages, and so on. So there are some things that really all languages do. But what we are primarily interested is what languages do as a general tendency. So we often allow exceptions. So let's take an example. As a general tendency, we can predict that if a language has the order of verb-object, so if they say, like, the dog chases the cat, then they also have prepositions. So the dog chases the cat in the garden. If a language has the object preceding the verb, like if they say, the dog the cat chases, then it's postposition. So they say the garden in, like the garden in, the dog the cat chases. That's the way you would do it in Turkish or in Japanese, for example. So we can sort of make predictions from the order of the object and verb to the order of prepositions or postpositions. And that's what we as grammarians find particularly fascinating. And now there are occasional exceptions, but they don't worry us so much. We see strong tendencies. There are worldwide tendencies. We see these tendencies on all continents. And so we say this is a universal, maybe relatively weak universal, or sometimes we say it's a statistical universal, but it's a strong trend that we find in the world's languages. Or let's take another example from phonology, from the sound systems. So in all languages, you have a tendency to have the vowels I, U, A, maybe also E and O. And some languages also have Ü or Ö or Ö, these kind of stranger vowels, but it's a strong tendency to have Ü or Ö, these strange vowels, only if you also have the normal vowels, U and I. So, but occasionally we do find exceptions. We do find languages that have I and U, but not U, for example, or so, once in a while. But still, it's a very strong tendency for languages to have I, U, A, E, U as a normal system. So we still count these as universals, and we look for explanations for these universal trends.
И здесь часто возникает вопрос у наших слушателей. Ну вот есть языковая семья, есть отдельный язык. А какое место в этой иерархии занимает диалект? Как его определить? Что такое диалект на эволюционной цепочке и на типологической цепочке?
Okay, so the question about dialects versus languages is not really related to the question about universals, I would say. It's related to the question about divergence. So how do language families diverge? And first, the divergence is into dialects. So we see this very nicely in the development of American English, for example, right? So first, presumably, the speakers of English that came to Massachusetts, presumably they were speaking more or less the same dialect or so. But as English expanded throughout North America, some dialectal differences developed. So in the Appalachian Mountains, they speak a sort of special dialect. There's also, something like a New York dialect now, and so on. So, as people expand into different areas and don't have so much contact anymore with the original area, some differences develop in a more or less random way, and that's how dialects develop. So, that happens with all bigger languages, with all languages basically that are spoken in more than 3 villages, there are usually some differences. In Russian, there's relatively few differences, but also some well-known differences between St. Petersburg and Moscow, for example. I mean, phonologists have talked about them. I don't know how important they are nowadays. So that's how dialects develop. And then over the centuries, after 1,000 years, if the differences still persist, then new languages arise. And you can get more and more differences then, and you can also discuss these differences in typological terms. So this has sometimes been done. So, for example, for the English dialects, people have tried to relate them to typological differences. So, people talk about analytic versus synthetic languages, and for the English dialects, they have tried to measure, are some English dialects more analytic, are some of them more synthetic? So, typology has become prestigious over the last 20, 30 years. So dialectologists have also tried to apply some typological concepts, but I don't think that the interaction is very clear. So I see dialectology really as helping us understand language divergence and historical linguistics, and typology is really more helped by looking at very diverse languages.
The phonetic differences between different regions in Russia, they're not that important for understanding. But if you're standing at a remote train station after midnight and try to communicate with someone whose intentions are not very clear, then these phonetic differences can cost you a lot. Maybe not only in Russia. Here, a couple of questions from the audience that are quite relevant. And you just mentioned that there are some cases when you find some universals, but cannot yet explain them. So, why and what are the one or two examples of such universals that are very hard to explain?
Maybe a good example is the fact that in verbs we often have tense marking, and also we often have aspect marking. So aspect is something that perhaps Russian listeners don't need to get an explanation for, because it's very salient in Russian and other Slavic languages. So in German we don't have aspect, so we always have to explain this. We have to say it's this thing that we found in Russian, but also in English, of course, like the difference between she walked and she was walking. So tense and aspect are very prominent in many languages. But, for example, languages almost never have coding of speed, like whether you do something quickly or slowly, right? That's almost never marking on a verb. But why is that? Because you would think that it's very important for everyday life, whether you do something slowly or fast, but it's never coded on verbs. Or another example, many languages have number marking, on nouns, but also on verbs. So difference between singular, plural, sometimes also dual. But in our everyday life, at least, in addition to number, also color is very important, right? Whether you have a blue bottle or a red bottle, or so why is color never marked on nouns or on verbs or so? So some things are marked again and again, like number and tense and aspect on verbs and nouns. Not in all languages. Many languages lack number marking, but when something's marked on nouns and verbs, then it tends to be number, tense, and aspect. And that is something that we don't know. So we don't really have a good explanation, at least not for speed, for example. I think we may have an explanation for color, because color is more important in modern industrial societies where we produce many different colors and bottles of different colors. In more traditional societies, flowers and animals do have different colors, but they're rarely distinguished only by the color. So in traditional cultures, we sort of understand that color terms are not so important, and so they won't make it into grammar. So, some things are kind of striking that we don't find them, and especially for speed marking, that's something I just thought of. It's surprising, and we don't know. So it could be that maybe tense and aspect is actually part of the biocognitive prerequisites that the Chomskyians have emphasized. So I wouldn't discount that as a possibility.
Okay, dear Chomskyans, we will give you tense and aspect, but nothing more. So another question from our audience, and I think it could conclude our discussion on language universals. And sounds very reasonable. I think I would have asked it even without a member of the audience. How can you even talk about language universals in a situation where the majority of languages have never been described properly?
Yes, that's a good question. There are probably about 7,000 languages. Some people say, well, maybe it's a bit too much, maybe more like 5,000 to 6,000 or so, because when you actually look at these language catalogs, often they list multiple languages that are really closely related and that should be counted as dialects. So, but there are at least 5,000 languages, and we have kind of really good descriptions of, maybe only half of that. But they're actually more good descriptions than many people think. So, until Harald Hammarström made the Glottolog and made sort of all this information available, I thought that we have perhaps only about 300 good grammars or so. But no, we have well over 1,000, and we have sketch grammars of a lot more languages. So probably about half of the world's languages are pretty well described. So it's actually not that bad. But in addition, it's also the case that, of course, we cannot always look at all the languages because even if the descriptions are there, we cannot read them all. So usually what we do is we do sampling. So it's a little bit like what someone does who studies, like in medical studies, certain forms of cancer, how do they arise and so on. You take a sample of the patients. You don't look at all the patients, but you still say, smoking causes cancer, right? It's still a universal of medical research. It's a very strong association. And, if we look at several thousands of patients or so, and we find it again and again, we say it's a universal, right? So sampling works in a rather similar way. Therefore, that gives us a pretty robust indication that certain trends must be there, even though, of course, we don't discount the possibility of exceptions. Just like, probably everyone knows someone who has been a heavy smoker all their lives, but they were very old, right? So exceptions don't mean that there isn't a very strong rule.
That's only your opinion, because many people use exactly that as an argument, like against, you see, there's no such thing.
Well, it's a scientific view that what counts is the quantitative evidence.
Дорогие друзья, вы прислали большое количество вопросов, у нас отобрана часть из них, и с удовольствием задаю вопрос. Я, с твоего позволения, пойду с конца. Юрий Макаров, который был у нас в подкасте с шугнанским языком вместе с Владимиром Плунгианом, задает вопрос. Юра спрашивает, в чем были главные ошибки лингвистов и лингвистики в 20 веке? И в чем главные достижения?
Well, in the 19th century, I think the main success, the main achievement is the discovery of the language families, as I already said. That is universally recognized, and archaeologists and geneticists really rely on our findings of the language families. They wouldn't be able to reconstruct human history without the language families. And the research on language families went on in the 20th century. And so that is the main achievement. And otherwise, in the 20th century, all kinds of new approaches were tried. Historical linguistics became less prestigious, maybe also because the 19th century was characterized by sort of nation building and by constructing the history of a nation, and thereby justifying. Just this morning, I was in the historical museum near the Kremlin in Moscow, and I saw this 19th century historical approach that was all over the Western world, and even beyond. History was very prestigious then, and in the 20th century, other things became more prestigious, such as cognitive linguistics, or also the structuralist approach in anthropology and linguistics. And I'm not so sure that they have been such big successes in structural and cognitive linguistics, because structures are really different in different languages. And how exactly we represent languages mentally is still pretty unclear. But of course, in the 20th century, entirely new domains of language were studied, like language acquisition, right? That was not studied in the 19th century. Or Pidgin and Creole languages were studied. These languages were despised in the 19th century, but we no longer despise them. We find it fascinating how, these Creole languages arose in the period of European creolization, or sign languages. The study of sign language that opened a completely new world. So there have been sort of big successes in terms of going into new domains, assembling corpora, looking at frequency distribution, and so on. So a lot of new things have been studied, and we know a lot more. But somehow my feeling is that there have not been the same kind of surprising breakthroughs of understanding in the 20th century as there have been in the 19th century, where suddenly linguists were able to say, oh, Madagascar must have been settled from Borneo because of the Austronesian language family. But this is subjective, of course.
One researcher of our institute, she actually didn't ask the question on Telegram, but she caught me here downstairs and said, like, if you can, please ask Martin this question. That she is a sort of typology skeptic. And so the question is, there seemed to be no complete agreement, consensus on sort of what a grammar of language is, like what it consists of, what it includes. And if there is still doubt about like what is a grammar description of a language, how can there exist a grammar typology? I don't know, like if I was going to ask this question myself, but the analogy I'm finding in my own head is like we don't really agree on what is a word. And so how can we argue, about words in different languages? So maybe this is a similar question.
Yeah, it's good to be skeptical of typology. It's generally good to be skeptical in science. We, to outsiders, we kind of often present the triumphs of science, but scientists sometimes go wrong and promise more than they can actually deliver at the end. So maybe typology currently is very prestigious, therefore also the name Martin Haspelmath is prestigious. So maybe typology is promising too much, right? So we should be skeptical. That's really good. And I understand that many linguists who study one particular language fear that I have not really understood my language well enough, so how can you possibly compare all these languages? The answer that I would give is that yes, of course, knowledge of each particular language is incomplete. So to the extent that it's incomplete, also our comparison of languages is incomplete. But we are steadily making progress. We are steadily making progress on describing and understanding particular languages. So we are also making progress on comparing languages. But everything is incomplete and maybe at a really preliminary stage. And in fact, my sort of first, one of my first teachers, Igor Melchuk, who I mentioned, said, you see, linguistics is at a very preliminary stage. It's maybe even at a stage where physics was or astronomy was before the Copernican revolution. So maybe we're still waiting for our big revolution in terms of depth of understanding. But that does not mean that we should not compare languages yet. We can, even if we have still a preliminary understanding, still do typology. And I know that there are also many people who just study one language who think that they profit enormously from the typologists, from the people who compare languages.
Whereas, linguistics has now recently been accused of being, too Europe-oriented, Western-oriented. And so it could be that, even if the half of languages is described, and the other half is totally different because we are so much, biased towards the West. So how can we in this case talk about, having a correct sample of languages?
Yes, it's long been a problem that Western linguists have been biased by their knowledge of Western languages. And that is still the case, of course, even if we try to look at languages from around the world. It's very difficult to escape this bias of our own languages. So I'm biased by German and English and maybe even by Russian. And maybe Chinese and Japanese linguists are biased by Chinese and Japanese. So that's very difficult to avoid. But we are aware of the bias. And typologists have quite long been aware that they need to look at worldwide samples. So the first research paper on sampling in typology was published in 1978, and there's a lot of methodological discussion of these issues. So we are aware of them, and while we cannot entirely avoid these problems, we usually think about them. And so I think we have made a lot of progress, and so in our samples, we very often include very few European languages, and we make sure to include enough languages from South America and from New Guinea and from Central Africa, where there are really lots of languages. So to the point where sometimes when we present our results, somebody from the Romance department also says, but you have no French, you have no Spanish, you don't have any Romance language. And I said, well, yeah, for Europe, we just included 3 languages. There was Welsh, Finnish, and Albanian. And then they may be disappointed, but we sort of sometimes really go out of our way to avoid this bias by the bigger languages.
Вопрос от Динары. Не планирует ли Мартин выпускать научную популярную книгу для того, чтобы можно было порекомендовать знакомым?
Okay, that's a very concrete question about my future now. We had a question about my past. I am happy to hear that the typological work that I've been doing is so popular these days, and I think it's really important to understand human language. One needs to look at lots of languages, and in a way, I have already written popular works. My papers are very easy to read normally. That's why many students read them and many people cite them, and that's why I'm so well known. And yesterday, when I was at the Higher School of Economics, there were like 60 people in the audience, a huge crowd of students. So I'm already going in that direction, and who knows what the future will bring.
Вопрос тогда с продолжением. Какую книгу вы порекомендовали бы почитать тому, кто хочет увлечься лингвистикой и понять, что это наука?
Well, I have a good friend here in Moscow, Vladimir Plungyan, who has a very nice book written «Почему языки такие разные?» and I think that's a very nice book, but I can also recommend a book sort of more of the Chomskyan orientation for someone who wants to get the counterweight. This is a book in English. It's called The Atoms of Language by Mark Baker. He's a very Chomskyan student of Chomsky's, but it's written in a wonderful, easy to understand way. It suggests that there are just a few parameters, or maybe a few dozen, and it compares languages with Mendeleev's periodic table of elements. So it says that we should try to understand languages like Mendeleev and chemists of the 19th century understood the chemical compounds and elements. It's a really wonderful book. I think it's a utopian idea. I think the whole thing does not work, but read the book for yourself. It's highly recommended.
I wonder what the radioactive elements of language are. Well, what we have left is actually a couple of personal questions, not too personal though. I wonder if there is anything that that you haven't found out yet, and it's so, it interests you so much that it almost sort of gives you no it's almost like you dream about it. You can't, sleep, because you think about this question. So is there anything that you still haven't found out about language that really interests you and are really eager to find it out?
Well, I'm interested in a lot of different things in the area of grammatical patterns, and I'm not really making individual discoveries, and as I said earlier, in the 20th century or so, there were not such big discoveries. It was just in the broad sense. So, maybe the image of a scientist is sort of, you make one big, like an archaeologist discovering the ancient ruins of a city or so. That's sort of the dream, as one big thing. And for me, the interest is primarily in trying to bring together insights from a range of different sources, and this is sometimes missing, I think, and that's where I think I can make a contribution, not highly specific, but sort of a kind of more broader overview, because increasingly I think it's a problem in our field, also in other fields of science, that there's a very high degree of specialization, so that scientists working in different areas of linguistics often don't understand each other anymore, because they use very specific formal methods, and sort of what I'm trying to do is to try to understand something from all the different areas and bring it together. And that's a rather broad ambition, and I think I'll continue with that for as long as I can.
Дорогие друзья, ваши вопросы, которые умещались в этот тайминг, были заданы. Но у меня остался последний вопрос. Есть ли свободное время у Мартина Хаспельмата и есть ли у Мартина Хаспельмата хобби?
Well, yeah, hobby is sort of this classical question that you ask people. Everybody's supposed to have a hobby. I guess rather early on, when I was 14, 15, 16 or so, linguistics became my hobby, and I was very happy that I managed to turn it into my profession. And so certainly linguistics, comparative linguistics is my passion. And I think in general you can be very successful in your profession if it's also your passion. That applies to every profession. I think there are many people who are cooks, who are, who do more practical things, that do this passionately and therefore successfully. And then I had the great fortune to have a family. We have 2 children, and so that was sort of also very time-consuming. The children are now grown up, and I guess my hobby now is to visit beautiful cities. And so this week I'm in Moscow, and so when I don't do linguistics, I don't go to all the talks of the conference for which I came here. Then I walk around the streets of Moscow and look at the architecture and consider the history. So, visiting beautiful cities like Moscow is, I guess, my main hobby.
И все-таки последнее. Кошки или собаки?
Собаки. Absolutely.
Друзья, у меня 2 собаки. Я свои вопросы закончил. Сейчас Дмитрий Игоревич что-то скажет, и будем выходить. Спасибо.
I thought, when we were talking about having something that you haven't found out, like if I were a devoted typologist, I would have a dream, I guess, that in 5 or 10 years, somewhere in Egypt, while digging around the pyramids, they would find a graffiti of Egyptians deciding on the word order in their language. So I think it would be this major breakthrough that we were looking for. And also, as far as hobbies go, when I was a student and the head of our department was Alexander Kibrik, so this famous field linguist. And every fall, he would bring apples from his, what would you call it? From his dacha. And we were like joking that he was growing them on the trees of dependencies and the trees of immediate constituents. So I guess that would be also a nice hobby. We thank you so very much. It has been a privilege and an honor to have you here. And I think I'm speaking on behalf of my colleague as well. He can trust me. So with this we conclude our episode. На этом мы заканчиваем наш выпуск, и от всей души мы уже поблагодарили в моем лице Мартина Хаспельмата. Это была большая честь для нас. Это был подкаст «Глагольная группа». Подписывайтесь на наш телеграм-канал «Глагольная группа». Мартин Хаспельмат подписался, господа и дамы. Подписывайтесь на наш телеграм-канал «Глагольная группа». Вступайте в нашу группу «Глагольная группа» ВКонтакте. Слушайте нас.
Слушайте нас на всех платформах, которых вы слушаете музыку. Это Apple Music, Google подкасты теперь перекочевали в YouTube Music, Яндекс.Музыка, ВК, YouTube. Ну, если вы нас смотрите, то смотрите, скорее всего, в YouTube. И вместе мы
разберем любой глагол, но только в типологической перспективе.
Только в типологической перспективе. Спасибо, дорогие друзья, что вы были с нами. Задавайте вопросы. Не забывайте отмечать колокольчиком, ставьте лайки. И работаем вместе с вами на, так сказать, просвещение. Всего доброго.